Welcome everyone to the AI and Big Data in Finance webinar. We are delighted to have two distinguished speakers today. So Andrea Eisfeldt from UCLA will present her paper, Labor Impact of Generative AI and Firm Values. Anastassia Fedyk from UC Berkeley is a discussant. Andrea will have 30 minutes for the presentation. If there are any clarifying questions in the Q&A, I will briefly interrupt her after 50 minutes to answer those. Anastassia has 20 minutes for her discussion. Afterwards, we open the floor from questions from the audience. As the audience, please submit your question in the Q&A. I will then call on you during the questioning part. And as a reminder, please be respectful with your comments. The presentation and discussion will be recorded and together with the slides posted on our website. After the main part of the webinar, we will have an unrecorded discussion where we promote everyone to a panelist. Now, without further delay, Andrea, the floor is yours. We are looking forward to your presentation.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me to present this paper. It is joint work with Gregor Schubert, Leti Taska, and Ben Zhang. So there's been, kind of don't need to say this anymore, super amount of excitement about ChatGPT changing the economy, changing jobs, changing firms. But the question of what the consequences are for firms and workers is something that we've only begun to scratch the surface of, and that is the focus of this paper. In particular, we think we're the first paper to look at the impact of the release of ChatGPT on firm values and changes in firm values due to the impacts on labor inputs. So there are two channels that we might expect potential gains from generative AI. The first being productivity improvements from incorporating AI. We think that what's interesting about generative AI is that it's a general purpose technology that's likely to affect all workers to some degree, a broad range of companies, so not just the tech sector, but we will see it having an impact throughout all industries, and we'll have some facts about which ones are more impacted. And then to improve productivity, generative AI can either be a complement or a substitute, and we'll have something to say about that. Yeah.
Your slides are not shared.
Oh.
I assume you want to share them too.
I do. So let me just do that. Sorry. Okay, so starting from the beginning, you missed the title slide and you missed this quotes of headlines, but we're really focused on firms and workers. And here we are talking about the two potential channels for the impact of generative AI. I talked about the first channel, which is the productivity improvements through impacts on things that labor typically does. And we're going to have a lot of evidence about that. And in particular, we're also going to have evidence about things for which generative AI is either complementary or a substitute. And then, of course, the other channel for generative AI is through product demand. So we've heard a ton about NVIDIA over the past over a year. And so we're going to have to be very careful to control for impacts of generative AI just through the product market. And we're going to have several ways of doing that. But what we're ultimately going to show is that the market was very quick to realize the potential productivity improvements through labor, mainly substitution, that is coming from generative AI, and to impound that into the value of firms across many industries and in a very interesting heterogeneous way that's consistent with what we think generative AI is very good at in terms of its capabilities. So just to preview, we are in some sense going to do a difference in differences event study. We're going to be focused on an event, which is the release of ChatGPT in November 22nd of November 15th, sorry. No, November 30th, 2022. So we have the 2 weeks before. And we're going to focus on that event because it was unexpected. We didn't know that was coming. And What we see is if we form a portfolio that is long firms that have a higher labor exposure to generative AI, meaning that generative AI can do more of the tasks that labor does in those firms, and we go short firms with lower labor exposure to generative AI, meaning that those probably are firms with a lot of manual tasks, then we get very high abnormal returns in the 2 weeks following the ChatGPT release. So that is the dark blue line, the red line being the artificial or high exposure firms, the green dashed line being the low exposure or more human related firms, the net of which being the dark blue line. We see that big divergence between the red and the green in the first 2 weeks following the release of ChatGPT. And then we see, the returns not being reversed. And in fact, we get another period of divergence following the release of the next version of ChatGPT, which occurred in early March of 2023. You can see that second divergence. We don't use that in the current study because it was anticipated. And you can see that the returns are actually anticipating that release because everybody was very excited about it at the time. So I'll go through this in detail, but this is just a preview of what we find. And I want to note that the overall market return during these 2 weeks was negative. So this was following rate increases and negative returns for the overall market. So what we're going to do is we're going to build up firm level exposure to generative AI at the worker level or at the firm level through the workforce composition, starting from tasks, moving up to occupations, and then moving to the portfolio of occupations that make up US publicly traded firms. So our data starts with the ONET data. And there are about 923 tasks in 923 occupations in the US. And those occupations are portfolios of 19,000 tasks. What we do is we use ChatGPT as our RA to score worker tasks for exposure to generative AI. So the 19,000 tasks get scores in terms of how able generative AI is to complete those tasks, and then we aggregate those tasks up to occupations and then finally up to firms. We are building on the measurement of Elandu et al. For our occupational scoring and the task level scoring. However, we are going to be adding to that in two important ways. One is that we are the first to be able to do firm level scoring of exposure to generative AI, which is very important if you want to think about valuation changes and heterogeneity across firms, maybe firms in different industries, firms within industries, or incumbents versus new firms. The other thing that we're going to do that's going to come later in the paper is we are going to be looking at what ONET thinks of as core versus supplemental tasks. So each occupation is a portfolio of tasks. Some of those tasks are core to the occupation, and some of them are supplemental. And we're going to see important differences when an occupation has a higher fraction of exposed core tasks versus supplemental ones. And that we think is related to whether generative AI may be substitutable in the case of generative AI being able to do the core task for an occupation versus potentially complementary when generative AI is more able to help with supplemental tasks. So the scoring at the task level is going to be 0, half, or 1, with 0 being no exposure, half being exposure, but ChatGPT is going to require some overlays, meaning external data, kind of if you do that retrieval augmented generative AI model where you're adding data or adding software to it, that would be a half exposure. And 1 means that 50% time saving equal quality is already feasible. And then occupation level scores will be the average exposure score of the occupation's tasks. So to give you some intuition, I'll talk about some tasks within occupations. So a task for a telemarketer occupation might be adjust sales scripts to better target. And the generative AI GPT model can do this already. It can do this at equal quality and half the speed. For web developers, the task of writing supporting code for web applications, again, the model can already do this with a score of 1. When we go to paralegal and legal assistance, investigating facts and law of cases and pertinent sources such as public record, internet sources, the score is a half exactly because it needs that additional overlay of customized data or information. And then when we go to more physical related occupations like heating, air conditioning, physician assistants, the model cannot do things like connect heating and air conditioning, and it cannot do therapeutic injections, for example. So we do 2 runs of the GPT model. We get the explanation for the scoring, and then we're going to use an average of those 2 runs. This is, building on work that has found that AI models can be better RAs than humans, more consistent, and we get it faster, cheaper, and with a lot of explanation of what the coding and scoring looks like. And we'll see that these scores have very intuitive relationships to other things that we're studying. So first of all, the occupation score can live between 0 and 1. If all the tasks in my occupation can be done by generative AI, like is almost the case for telemarketers, then that occupation is going to get a score of 1. So again, each of the 923 occupations has some portfolio, say 15 to 20 of the 19,000 tasks. For telemarketers, ChatGPT can do almost all of the tasks within that occupation. When we get down, these are the most exposed occupations. We still have a very high exposure for mathematicians, programmers, office clerks, and I think this is all very intuitive. Those scores are more in the 0.8, 0.75 range. And then if we go to the lowest exposure occupations, I want to note that 17%, a full 17% of BLS occupations have 0 exposure. This is alphabetical, so it's the end of the alphabet. So we have occupations like shampooers and wellhead pumpers showing up here as having 0 exposure. There's just not much that generative AI can do here. And I want to say, one of the interesting questions I think on people's mind is, how is this technology shock, this, in some sense, automation shock, different from or similar to the robotics wave that we had in the 80s and 90s in manufacturing mainly? And we're going to show that it's similar in the sense that we mainly find a substitution effect like you had with automation previously. But it's going to be very different in the sense that it's going to affect very different professions and different skills. So here we have on the x-axis the wages for various occupations, and on the y-axis I have the generative AI exposure score, so how exposed to being having the tasks in those occupations being able to be conducted by generative AI on the y-axis. And what you see in the upper right are occupations that are highly paid and have high exposures like computers and mathematical, legal, management, business and finance, architecture, and engineering. On the bottom left, with the low wages and also low exposure, you see things like grounds cleaning and maintenance, food prep and serving, farming, fishing, forestry, and healthcare support. So this is different from previous automation waves in that it is affecting higher wage occupations. It's also affecting a different type of occupation in terms of the kind of types of tasks that it does. So we just provide a relationship between our exposure to generative AI through the tasks and occupations to the Echemoglu and Otter occupational skill scores. And what you can see is that the highly exposed occupations by our measure are the non-routine cognitive analytical and the routine cognitive occupations, not the, at the bottom there, non-routine manual physical or routine manual occupations that were exposed to the prior automation wave. So again, very different skills being impacted, perhaps not surprisingly, but verifying that the measure is capturing something, that we intuitively want it to do. So moving up to firms, And this is really one of the key innovations in our measurement. We use the LinkedIn profiles from Revelio Labs, which has firm employment by occupation. So now we're going to think of firms' labor forces as a portfolio of occupations. So occupations are portfolios of tasks that either can or can't be done by generative AI. And then firms are portfolios of those occupations. So an exposure of a firm is that firm's employment share of that occupation times the occupation score, and then summing over the occupations in that firm. These are just the, we take the 100 largest firms because, as you know, that will ensure that we sort of know who all these firms are. And then I'm going to show you here the 15 out of the top 100 firms, the 15 firms with the highest generative AI exposure. And then I'll show you the lowest. So the highest is actually IBM, that has a score of about 1/2, which means that once you move from tasks to occupations to the firm level, ChatGPT can do about half of the total tasks within IBM. And I was listening to podcasts, as I do in the morning, and I was hearing about Watson getting advertised. There's certainly a lot of coding that goes on at IBM, but also at Intuit. We see a lot of information firms. We see a lot of finance firms, S&P Global. We see PayPal in here, and Adobe and some others. Now, we also see NVIDIA, so we know that it's going to be key to control for product market exposures here. The lowest exposure firms are firms with more manual tasks, like Starbucks and McDonald's, and some manufacturing firms. And again, we think this is intuitive. You can see that even when you get to the bottom, Starbucks, it's still 11% or 12%, but I'm still happy that we're going to have human baristas. I'm not necessarily always a fan of the iPad ordering, although probably I do like the app. So let me move on to, I've talked about exposures. Now I want to talk about the impact on firm values. So the first thing I want to show you is how much attention, that this was a surprise, the release of GPT, and it was highly noted by investors. So I'm going to show you the response on Twitter in terms of Twitter mentions, but we also have data on earnings calls and showing that firms with more exposure actually mention it more in earnings calls. This is just Twitter mentions on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And what you can see is upon the release, there's this huge spike in Twitter mentions. It maybe peaks about a little less than a week into the release period. We're going to use 2 weeks as our release period. We have a 1-week period in the appendix, but we want to have a short enough time that we don't have confounding information in terms of what else is going on to impact firm values, but a long enough period for something that is as complex as the impact of ChatGPT on firms through the impact on the labor force to be impounded into stock prices. So we settle on 2 weeks, and we have a 1-week robustness check in the appendix, and we can kind of provide evidence for any other event period. But using the Twitter mention, this seems like a good way to go. And what we're going to do is we're going to sort stocks by their generative AI exposures into quintiles. And I'm going to form a long-short portfolio that compares the returns of the artificial firms in the highest quintile of exposure, meaning GPT can do a lot of the tasks and the occupations in those firms. And I'm going to go short the human portfolio, which is the portfolio of firms where GPT has a lower ability to complete those tasks in those firms. And I formed this AMH portfolio. Now, unlike other portfolios with 3-letter acronyms, I like this one. It's a cute one, artificial minus human. It's not about risk exposures, though. It's not small minus big. It's not high minus low. We are looking at the effect on firm values from an event. Again, this idea of doing the difference across high versus low exposures in the changes in value of firms after this event of the release of ChatGPT. Noting the overall market return was negative of these 2 weeks, and the returns are insignificant in terms of their differences during the rest of the sample. The returns during that 2-week window they're kind of 40 to 44 basis points, depending on what other controls we include. So this is a huge return in a short amount of time. This is the picture we saw before. I've included a longer pre-period so that you can see there's nothing going on prior to the release date. Once we have the release, we see this divergence. Then we kind of have, you know, nothing much going on for a little while. We have the next release of the next model and the anticipation of that. And we again see the divergence between the green and the red portfolios, as shown in the AMH portfolio that is graphed here in blue. So I'm going to show you that the event portfolio returns are robust to controlling for the FAMA French 5 factors. Instead of 44 basis points, we find 35 basis points. If we exclude the tech sector, it's 38 basis points. So that's an important first step in showing that our measure is and our returns are robust to controlling for product market exposures. Similarly, if we sort within industries, so within each industry, we just look at the difference in returns between the high exposure firms and the low exposure firms. So within 3-digit industries, it's 30 basis points. And if we use the FIC industry codes, we have 23 basis points. We also control for product market exposure using four direct measures, I should say. 2 10K based measures, which is one is text-based, one is just counting mentions of data. There's also a Goldman Sachs paper that sort of looks like it has pretty similar information to our paper that was released before the Goldman Sachs paper, but it's an ex post categorization of firms. And then we use this very nice measure from Anastassia's own work, which is the AI skill share in terms of the employment mix. And what I'm going to show you on the next slide is if we look at the leftmost column and then move along the rows, we have the various measures of the product market exposures along with the generative AI exposures. And what you can see there is we're starting with this 28 basis point return because of the industry fixed effects that we're controlling for. So this is within industry. Then we have 29 20, 26, 20, 17 and a half once we control for everything. So no matter what we control for in terms of product market exposures, we're not finding very different results to what our individual, our original results are. And I want to note that all of these, except for the text-based exposure, are significant when they're included individually. And you see the significant results of the BFHH product market exposure. Those measures may be more correlated with each other. We haven't dug into that, but because they're not individually significant when we include them together, but there is, of course, an effect moving from a coefficient of 0.29 to 0.18. So the product market exposure is certainly important, but the labor market exposure is robust to those controls. We also asked the question about data. So one of the interesting questions in thinking about the impact of generative AI is, are we going to see firms get replaced, like digital photo companies replaced Kodak, or is it going to be the incumbent firms that benefit? One distinct advantage that incumbent firms have in this technological revolution or technology shock is that they have something that is complementary to the technology itself. They have in-house data corpuses, and we're going to show that there is a high level of data complementarity. We're going to use 2 main measures. One is a 10K measure of data assets coming from the business description. The other is a more labor-focused, similar to the ABFHH measure, which is the Abbas and Veldkamp measure of data management skills in a firm. When we see the interaction now of the generative AI exposure interacted with a measure of data assets, you see that coefficient highlighted in blue here, you see that the impact of a high generative AI exposure on firm values is much higher when you have greater data assets. And in fact, now the level exposure is not significant. So we have this kind of statement from McKinsey: if your data is not ready for generative AI, you are not ready. Clearly, the firms that are benefiting from generative AI have both data and tasks in their workforce that can be done by ChatGPT and other generative AI models. And that may explain why incumbent firms are benefiting. So what is the impact of generative AI on labor generally? We want to drill down onto this mechanism that we propose. Once we control for product market exposure, we want to say that the impact on firm value comes from productivity improvements of generative AI, either being able to actually do the task full on or complementing workers that do those tasks. So we're gonna use this classification in the ONET data that somehow people have overlooked. We're not really aware of people utilizing this classification that is in the ONET data, which classifies tasks in each occupation as core, which means that it's key for performing the function, versus supplemental, meaning that this is really just outside the core, is really the complement to the key function of the occupation. So we compute this share of tasks in an occupation that is supplemental, with the idea that if generative AI can really do your supplemental tasks, maybe it's more of a complement to you. Whereas when it can do the core tasks, meaning the key task for the occupation, it's probably more of a supplement, a substitute for you. And that is exactly what we find. So the effects on labor in terms of hiring, wages, and the effects on firm values in terms of returns and profits are going to actually be much lower when GPT can mainly do the supplemental tasks. So that means that the main productivity improvements come from substituting labor, increasing firm profits through substitution to cheaper technology, and that flows through also to returns. And that's basically how I'm going to spend my last few minutes here. So first, more exposed firms reduce hiring for exposed roles. So this is the impact of being post-ChatGPT release and being in a high exposure occupation on job postings. So we see the negative coefficient there, and we have the regression equation above the table. If we look at that coefficient, the post times generative AI exposure times share supplement, you now see that the coefficient is positive, meaning that effect of a higher exposure on job postings is much lower if the job that is exposed has only supplemental tasks being done by GPT versus core tasks. So you see the post times generative AI now coefficient being much larger. And then when we interact with supplement, you see that it's weakening the impact on job postings. So if you are a worker who can be the engine driver and use that engine to do your supplementary tasks, you actually are seeing much lower impact on your job postings. That's also true for firms in terms of profitability. The profits are much higher for firms that have a higher generative AI exposure in their workforce through the core tasks that can probably be, or potentially be, or likely be directly substituted by GPT. So again, for profits, we see that if it's supplemental tasks that are exposed, the change in profits is lower, and the change in profits is higher for firms with the core task exposure. Similarly, for returns, we see that if we look at the returns of the firms where a higher fraction of those exposures are coming from supplemental tasks, the returns are still higher. But at the average supplemental versus core task exposure, the effect is about 1/3 of the overall effect when you look at the effect coming from the supplemental tasks. So the returns as well are mainly being driven in that initial period, at least, by the firms for which core tasks can be done by GPT, which we think is suggestive of an initial reaction to this technology shock of high returns to firms with high exposures, in particular, high exposures that come from core tasks that can be done by GPT, and consistent with the idea that GPT is actually a substitute for labor in those tasks. And that's consistent with job postings, with hiring, with firm profits, with firm returns, as well as with wages declining more in occupations that have a higher core task exposure to generative AI. So I might be 1 minute over. I apologize for that. So let me conclude. We study this large technological shock in real time, which we think is, kind of novel given the information technology that we already had when we had the release of ChatGPT. It had an immediate positive impact on the value of exposed firms, but there's a ton of heterogeneity I didn't get into in terms of whether within all industries, it's not necessarily good to have a high exposure. On average, it is good for firms to have a higher exposure, in particular when their higher exposure comes from being exposed to core tasks. There's a definite impact on worker, where especially for workers with core task exposure, that impact being negative in terms of lower jobs, fewer jobs, lower wages. But there is still this potential to have those complements play out. And it's important to understand these things in terms of the impact on firm values, because we have both a potential transfer from labor to owners to capital owners, but also heterogeneity within the capital owners and within the providers of the labor input. So I encourage you to read the paper for more details, and I'm really looking forward to Anastassia's discussion.
Thank you so much for this fantastic talk, Anastassia. Now the floor is yours.
Super. You got the slides from the get-go? All right, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to discuss this paper. I'm a big fan of this paper. It's nice to see how it's evolving. And I definitely like the addition of kind of more emphasis on the labor and market impact from the previous versions that I've seen. So bit of an overview, but of course, we just saw Andrea's presentation, so I'll be super brief. I think this paper has a really kind of novel take on understanding how technology affects firm value by tracking this new technology in pretty much real time, as Andrea said at the end. So it's looking at the recent advances in commercial generative AI, especially ChatGPT at its first iteration, and how that translates into firm value. So tracking that right in real time, looking at that event, that 2-week window in December 2022. And the variation, of course, is then cross-sectional based on firms' ex-ante exposures to this new technology. The empirical challenges when one sets out to do a project like that is, of course, measuring firms' exposure to generative AI, as well as some of those additional really cool things that Andrea showed in terms of where that exposure is coming from, core tasks, supplemental tasks, whether firms have data assets, and so on. So the measure is a big challenge. And then, of course, the mechanisms, so understanding what is driving that. And that's where the measures come in really handy with the core and supplemental tasks, that it helps us understand better what are those labor-based mechanisms that are contributing to firm value. How do the authors get around those challenges? Well, they construct a measure of exposure to generative AI that aggregates up from the task level, where the individual tasks get classified, leveraging the summarization classification capabilities of generative AI itself, instead of tons and tons of human arrays, to classify tasks into exposure, kind of 3 categories of exposure, then aggregating that up to an occupation level, and then finally aggregating from the occupations to the firm level using the employee shares from LinkedIn profiles from Revelio Labs data. Then the data assets, there are a couple of ways that the paper measures those. That's relying on sort of a pre-existing measure from Simona and Laura's work, as well as, again, leveraging the ChatGPT capable classification summarization capabilities to classify based on the 10K text. And then finally, for what I personally think is the most interesting kind of insight here, looking at the mechanisms, the authors leverage this, as Andrea pointed out, previously underutilized classification of core versus supplemental tasks, which is already there in ONET, but is not widely used. But in this paper fits in really neatly into understanding whether that exposure to generative AI is coming from tasks that are core to that occupation versus tasks that are supplemental, that automating those would actually just increase the ability of those workers to focus more on their core tasks. And we see that there are pretty different effects depending on whether the exposure comes from core or supplemental tasks. So some of the main findings, there is a lot in the paper, so this is just handpicking a couple of the main headline findings. A long-term portfolio based on this exposure to generative AI has a significant positive return right after ChatGPT release, on the order of about 0.5% daily. So that's pretty substantial. This relationship between returns and the exposure to generative AI is stronger in the firms that have more data assets, consistent with pre-existing data benefiting those firms' ability to leverage the new technology. And this relationship is pretty robust. It survives other factors. It survives controlling for other types of benefits from AI, like product exposure and so on. And then finally, on the mechanism side, what we see is that once we take a look at whether the exposure is coming more from core or supplemental tasks, we observe lower job postings, so lower demand for workers, lower wages, higher profitability, and higher returns. That 2-week return is also higher in the firms where the generative AI exposure comes mostly from their core tasks rather than their supplemental tasks. So that speaks to a potential labor displacement mechanism rather than just complementing labor and allowing those workers to focus more on their core tasks. So as I mentioned, I'm especially interested in the kind of labor mechanism. I'm going to have a couple of comments first on the measure side in terms of validating the measures, but also kind of my personal views about which of the measures or which of the results maybe we can de-emphasize more, which ones we can focus on more, because the paper is quite comprehensive and long and has a lot in there. And then I'll give a couple of comments on where maybe I would like to see a little more in terms of the results. So on the measurement side, I'll start with just the overall measure, the measure of exposure to generative AI, which starts with classifying tasks. There are about 19,000 different tasks into this kind of trio exposure measure, from completely exposed to not exposed at all. And this is done using ChatGPT itself to summarize kind of which tasks are potentially replaceable. And of course, the advantage of doing the classification with generative AI rather than human arrays is that it's much more time and cost effective than having somebody sit there and classify 19,000 tasks. I would personally still like to see a human, or actually a few humans, label a subset of those tasks. And if the arrays are not doing well, then maybe we can even have a validation on a subset of the subset by the co-authors. But the reason that I think this would be helpful is twofold. First is that it gets an additional validation that the ChatGPT classifications are comparable to what we've done in the past, which is having humans label things. There is validation already that the ChatGPT measures make sense, that they highlight the kinds of occupations, we aggregated up the kinds of occupations, the kinds of firms we would expect to be more exposed. And there's also cross-validation between several runs of the ChatGPT labeling, so that's great. I think it will give an additional validation to have it cross-validated in a subset of tasks against arrays. And the second thing is that I think it can actually highlight more a second advantage of ChatGPT labeling that was pointed out in the paper, which is that they're pretty consistent. So if you do the labeling several instantiations, you get really similar responses from the ChatGPT labels. I would be curious to see whether that consistency is actually greater than the consistency you would have between multiple human arrays. And my guess is that that's likely the case. And so if it performs just as well and is more consistent, that's another reason to move on to this type of classification in the future. So I think that would be a great additional validation to show. My second measure comment is not on the main exposure measures, but on the data assets measures. And here I struggled a little bit in terms of whether they were really capturing the same thing and what were they capturing. So there are two data assets measures. And the good news is that the results are very similar using both of them. But the measures themselves, I'm not sure how similar they are. So this is the correlations table, which I believe got added after my previous discussion of this paper, which is great. Gave me a lot more kind of understanding of which measures are related to others. And the highest single correlation in this entire table is the ABIS and Veldkamp data exposure measure with the generative AI exposure measure. So the data exposure measure is less correlated with an alternative data exposure measure. They're correlated to it's 0.43, right, the two data measures. But the highest correlation in the whole table is not between the product exposure measures with each other. It's not between the data exposure assets measures with each other, but instead it's between this data exposure measure that's built on the job postings, right? That's how Bryan and Simona were measuring things, and the generative AI measure, which is also built on the job postings. So what this suggests to me is that maybe what the measures are capturing, at least a good part of it, is something about the domain. So the ABIS and Veldkamp data assets measures correlated with something else is built on the job postings, another exposure measure that's built on job postings, and the 10K based data assets measure, other than with the other data assets measures, highly correlated with the GPT 10K based product exposure measures. So again, maybe capturing something about the domain, the 10K text. So that's something to kind of consider, to potentially address. I mean, it might also be possible to just drop the data assets result just because the paper is long and has a lot, and I would kind of like to see more on the labor channels. But one other potential suggestion is to also include this measure, the ABIS and Veldkamp data assets measure, in that horse race where we kind of included the product measures and showed that the generative AI exposure measure survives the addition of that, and the effect slightly declines, but is very, very robust. I would maybe include the ABIS and Veldkamp data assets measure in there as well, just because it is the one that seems to actually be capturing something that's closest to the generative AI exposure. And then finally, getting closer to the mechanisms, on the core and supplemental tasks exposure measure, I would actually like to see more to go deeper into kind of decomposing the two. Right now, the main measure here is just the share of the occupation exposure, right? So we have kind of the total exposure of an occupation to generative AI. And then we'll look at what fraction of that comes from supplemental rather than core tasks. So that's kind of a fraction. And this measure would be similar, right, for two occupations, where one just has a lot of exposure in both core and supplemental tasks, and one has very little exposure in both core and supplemental tasks, but the relative ratios would be similar. This kind of differential exposure measure would analogously be similar. I would like to see a little more about, I guess, the directional effects of both core and supplemental tasks. And what is the actual effect of having more of the supplementary tasks be exposed to generative AI? Is it that we get the increase in firm value is larger, right, for firms where exposure comes from the core tasks? But if you don't have exposure coming from the core tasks, you're only having supplemental tasks. What is the kind of effect of that? What is the difference between a firm that has very little rate exposure in both and a lot? And yeah, I would just maybe like to see those two measures, the core and supplemental tasks, separately, right? So we can have the ratio, but we can also just decompose the sum into those two parts and see how each of them relates to firm value. I would be curious to see. And relatedly, right, on kind of the mechanism side, I would like to see more on like what are the effects on total labor, because the paper's kind of main effect is firm value, which is right in that 2-week window after release of ChatGPT. And then there is the additional effects that look at job postings, right? So that's new hiring. So you see that the demand for new workers is declining in firms that are more exposed through their core rather than supplemental tasks. And I think this makes a lot of sense given the short time frame of the analysis, right? The new hiring, new demand, that's what we get to see immediately, versus the kind of equilibrium total state of labor, something that takes longer to observe. But that said, I think there's a little bit of a wedge between the main effect, which is looking at firm value, and that's forward-looking, right? That incorporates all future expectations, and then the labor channels that look just at the short-term hiring. And so I would like to see a bit more of the total labor of the firm, so occupation, right? Level employment at the firms. And I think it's possible, again, we don't have a long time series, but it's possible to look, say, 1 year out. I think at this point should be more or less okay with resumes, or maybe at least 6 to 8 months out. If there's already a meaningful reduction, I think that would kind of further strengthen the labor channel. And the reason I think it's possible that we'll already in the short period of time pick up an effect on total labor is that there is a significant effect on profitability at those firms. So the operations are actually reflecting pretty quickly the effect of generative AI. And so likely we can already pick up a real labor effect as well. But yes, that's something to be seen. I think that would be a really neat thing to add. And relatedly, going back to that market impact, right, that we see the substantial return in the couple of weeks right after the release, there is a conceptual question of kind of how does that market impact happen, right? Does the market just correctly anticipate the reduction of the employees with certain tasks, right, whose core tasks with their occupations are exposed in the future, maybe complementarity of some other employees with generative AI? Or is it that we're getting some signals in terms of, right, what actually starts happening at those firms and then additional market impact? So it is, of course, potentially difficult to predict, right, exactly how much displacement and how much impact there will be when a new technology just comes out. So I would be curious to see a bit more about whether there is any gradual adjustment here. Now, of course, the challenge, as Andrea pointed out, is that this was not a one-time release, and once we're a couple months in, we already have, right, the next wave of GPT being released, so that, of course, muddles the results. But something like tying back to what I said in the previous slide, looking at maybe some reductions, some layoffs, total labor effects, whether we see kind of additional market impact happening at the firms, right, that are more exposed in certain occupations when those occupations subsequently getting reduced. So just a bit more potentially either discussion of kind of conceptually how we think this is happening, or maybe some empirics if it's possible. But again, I understand that the time series is both short and has too many things happening in a row. But I think one other thing that would be maybe informative is within the time frame that we have, and again, I understand it's short, and right, we want to cut it off before, say, March 2023. But we have a couple of months on either side, and looking at different time windows, right? So right now, the main specification is that 10 days to 2-week window, but a little shorter, a little longer, I think would be helpful, both for robustness, but also potentially additional support for the mechanism, right? If we get progressively slightly larger effects as we extend the window, we're of course becoming less precise. So the standard errors would also increase, but if we have some gradual adjustment that would support, right, a certain type of learning, and if we have a more instantaneous adjustment, that would support a different kind of effect. This is the longer time series graph that Andrea showed, and so the blue is kind of the window that we're actually looking at the paper. The red is basically an analogous 2-week window before, where nothing is happening. The full time series here is before the next release of ChatGPT. So this is kind of what would be available to look at. And in general, there's nothing kind of going on before. There is, I would say, potentially some more adjustment for a month or two after. Now, of course, it's always possible to cherry pick, right, a window that would look better and a window that would look worse. So if we just extended kind of twice, right, and look at 1 month, then it would start to look like a pre-trend. I don't think that's the case, because, right, if we extend it even a little bit longer, we're back to 0. But I think what is interesting on this graph is also looking at the two parts, right, the human and the machine portfolios that contribute to that long-short portfolio. And maybe this is just my recent, I guess, work on betas and co-movements and so on. But I was struck by the co-movement, or sometimes, right, the opposite co-movement between the human and the AI portfolios, especially before the ChatGPT release. The green line and the gray line that seem to be going have to, if anything, maybe a negative correlation in the high frequency. And that's something that I think it would be interesting to touch on a little more, is just what happens to the two parts, right? Is it that with what we expect with the mechanism that artificial portfolio is basically gaining value because of the replacement, so the profitability increases, human portfolio declines in value just by competitive effects. So a negative correlation during the window is what we would expect, is that they'd move in opposite. They would move in opposite directions. Once ChatGPT comes out, that's kind of part of the story, is that it's a positive effect on one and then negative effect on the other. But if there's actually negative correlation, I don't know whether that's true. That was just eyeballing before the window. That's something that's puzzling. So why were the exposed firms maybe negatively correlated to begin with, where it seemed like the correlation maybe turned positive here after the release, once the, like, maybe a month and a half or 2.5 months had passed. So that's something that I would like to see a bit more. And again, that could potentially help support some types of the mechanisms over others. So I think my time is right about over, also a little bit over, sorry about that. This is a really fun paper. I've always, the several times I've looked at it, really enjoyed, and it just gets better and better. I really like this kind of increased emphasis on the labor mechanisms. I think the paper overall is an exciting opportunity to track a new technology and the market impact. But those novel measures really allow us to see what's happening really granular with the labor of the firms, and speak to the mechanisms with kind of what types of exposure are the ones driving the results. And that's something that I've not seen in any of the previous papers, with kind of the core supplemental occupations and so on. I think that's really clever, really interesting. I would like to see even more on those exposure measures. I think the measures are going to be used by other papers, and they're really compelling to me. So I'd like to see even a little bit more kind of validation on some of them. And the results, of course, are very much relevant. So I have a couple of suggestions in grounding them a little further and adding a bit more support for that labor channel. So if anybody has not had a chance to read this paper, I would very much recommend it. So thank you for inviting me to discuss it.
Thank you very much for the great discussion. For the audience, if you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A, and I will call on you then. While we are collecting more questions from the audience, Andrea, would you like to respond to the discussion very briefly?
Sure. That was super fun. I think, Anastassia, you discussed the paper when I wasn't there, and I've seen the slides, but it's great to hear your thoughts in person. And of course, it's great. Thanks for organizing an expert discussant for the paper. So I don't have a lot of comments. It's a really great discussion. The human array, I think that is a great idea. So what we did is we spot checked ourselves, but that of course is not, and we did all this correlated with things we think, but I think that's a great idea. We can totally have humans do it there are papers that are specifically focused on comparing human and machine arrays, but it wouldn't be a bad idea to get some of that in here. I think the comment there are a couple of comments that are really intriguing. One is the correlation between the Veldkamp data measure and our exposure measure. So both do come from jobs. One comes from job postings and one comes from LinkedIn. So it's not that the domain is exactly the same, but it's both coming from the job side. And so I want to think about that more. The way we interpret it is that there's this complementarity between data assets, and then you would have data workers, and then you would be able to take advantage of generative AI. But, I think it's a very good idea to kind of investigate further where that correlation comes from. I like that idea a lot. And that'll potentially help us, get at the mechanism more. Maybe we can use the core supplementary somehow there too. The changing correlation, we'll just look at that and see what we can learn from that. We've talked about your work with Tanya on the changing, changing market beta of AI firms, which I think is super interesting. So we'll have a look at that. And we definitely examined more windows. And yeah, we'll take all the comments to heart. They are excellent. And I really appreciate that.
Great. So Richard Blake said a question. I can promote you to panelist to ask it.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. My question again was around the data assets analysis. I was surprised to see the strength of the effect of complementarity, given that presumably the data assets component is only relevant to those tasks which have where data is required as an overlay, which I presume isn't going to be is only going to be a share of all tasks. Can you say a bit more about what you think is going on there?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting comment. And you picked up on something that kind of I have questioned. So we kind of debated because we followed this earlier paper on the task level exposures by allowing for a 0, a 1, and a 1/2 exposure, and the half being requiring these additional overlays. It turns out that a fair number of the results are actually robust to just using 0 and 1. And I feel a little that it could just be a little bit cleaner, and it would be very interesting to see how that changes the data results. I actually don't know the answer to that one. But I think that even if you don't need to overlay outside software and data, and it's true that your generative AI model will be much more valuable if you kind of combine the internet and Wikipedia with your own data corpus. I think those data measures are just are proxying for both the value of being able to, because even if generative AI can do the task, it can probably do it better and more targeted. Like if you think about targeted marketing or like the telemarketing example, you can do it probably already with the model itself, but it's going to be a lot better with the additional private data. Like there's public data on demographics, but the private data probably makes it even better. But I like that. I like that you're pushing on that, because we haven't really connected those two things, the half exposure with the data assets, but it's a great idea. Yeah, I appreciate that.
Senior Sefi asked a question, which I think you answered before. How was the performance of this AMH portfolio before the ChatGPT release? And I think you've shown the whole time series, so probably we know the answer. I also have a question, but I think I'm going to ask it in the when we promote everyone to a panelist, because we are running out of time and I want to make an announcement very quickly. So we are excited for our next webinar, which will be on June 20th. So we will have Jules van Binsbergen from Wharton presenting his work on almost 200 years of new space sentiment. Please visit our website for more details. And I would like to ask everyone to stay in the Zoom room while we upgrade you to panelists, and we are going to continue this discussion. And let me conclude with a large applause for both presenters.